this second lecture, we're going to look briefly at Nietzsche and his influence on modern philosophy. Nietzsche was mostly ignored during his life, but in 1888 there was a series of lectures on his work given by George Brandes. Now, as we know from the last lecture, after this point he has his breakdown and his sister Elizabeth takes over his estate and uses his work to create The Will to Power and also to send his work to people such as Mussolini and to Hitler. After the Second World War, Hitler's work was ignored for quite a while because of his links with the Nazis, and he was really brought back into philosophical thought by the translations done by Walter Kaufmann and by R.J. Hollingdale, who helped to bring Nietzsche to a new generation of writers. One of Nietzsche's most well-known commentators was Heidegger. Heidegger wrote a 4-volume collection of lecture notes titled Nietzsche that was published in 1961. These relied heavily on The Will to Power. Now, given that Heidegger, of course, has Nazi links, this should not be too surprising. Heidegger was, of course, also associated with the Nazis, and he thought that National Socialism could free German thought from being reduced to mere life. And Heidegger's work inspired new interpretations in post-war France. However, Heidegger's interpretation, as Spink says, argued that Nietzsche's insistence on life as force and will was anything but a radical anti-metaphysical maneuver. So this is a different interpretation here, but it's one that really fits in with Heidegger's views, and we can see there how the will to power follows through that. But this led to an interest in Nietzsche in French philosophy, and as we'll see next, that's where Nietzsche has been extremely influential in philosophy. Nietzsche then has been very important in modern French philosophy, and it has been said that to understand French 20th century philosophy, you need to understand Nietzsche. Some of the French philosophers that have written about Nietzsche include Gilles Deleuze, who wrote Nietzsche and Philosophy in 1962. We have, of course, Michel Foucault, who wrote Nietzsche, Genealogy and History in 1971. We have Jacques Derrida, who wrote Spurs in 1978, and we have Sarah Kaufmann, who wrote Nietzsche, a Metaphor in 1978. Now, we're actually going to look at Foucault and Sartre in a little bit more detail, and of course these are very famous philosophers that I expect you have heard of. Foucault then was interested in the will to power, but also Nietzsche's ideas on genealogy. Now, Foucault is a very interesting philosopher, and he argued that we should look to language to try and determine the hidden agendas of society and dissemination of knowledge. And an example that we can use to give a brief look into his ideas is the example of a crime case. So when you have a crime case, the criminal is labelled as such, and they're labelled by the courts, by lawyers, and there's no objective valuation of what a criminal actually is. It can differ from country to country. What is illegal in one country can be legal in another. And of course, what is legal at one point in history may not be illegal at another point. So if we take the example of homosexuality in the UK, historically that has been illegal, but today it is not. So Foucault's point is that what would make you a criminal 100 years ago, or in, for example, in another country, would not make you a criminal today in the UK. And so this leads for Foucault to say, why do we have the understandings of what a criminal is? Well, he's interested in how this links into the agendas of society and how the language we use, so the word criminal, what is its significance? What is the actual meaning behind it? And he argues that this is often linked to power, that it is a power exercise. Now, Foucault disagreed with the concept of inalienable rights. He says there's no such thing as an objective good. So when we look at Foucault's ideas, we can see a link to Nietzsche in that Foucault does not believe in this external truth. He does not believe in an objective good. And he takes the ideas about genealogy that Nietzsche applies to morality, and he applies them in other areas. So Foucault then is a very useful example of a philosopher who has taken Nietzsche's ideas and looked at them in other areas. One philosopher that was particularly influenced by Nietzsche is Sartre. Now, Sartre lived from 1905 to 1980, and he was a French philosopher that I expect you've probably heard of. He was quite the celebrity in his time. Sartre was an existentialist, and he believed that existence precedes essence. Now, what this means is that he believed that instead of being born with purpose, given to us, for example, by a god, we come into existence and then must find our own purpose. And we can see the links here to Nietzsche's ideas. Nietzsche argued, of course, that God is dead, and one of his consequences from the death of God was that we must create our own values. But what Sartre is saying is that rather than being born with a purpose, being born with an essence, something that makes us what we are, we must instead create that essence ourselves. He says that we are unable to face the world as it is, and so we create ideals. And he wrote the book Nausea in 1938, where he talks about nausea as being an awareness of living in this world where there is no essence, where there is not a firm truth to what the world is, an awareness of living. The term nausea was actually also used by Nietzsche in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And we have a quote here from Sartre which says, "Man is condemned to be free because once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does." So we can see the shadow of Nietzsche here in Sartre's thought, in that, like with the death of God, without a truth to the world, without a God giving meaning to the world, man is free, just as Nietzsche has said that we are free to create our own values. Man is free to create our own essence. And once we come into the world, we then are responsible for everything that we do. Sartre also uses the concept of the absurd. And the absurd is the search for answers or meaning in a world without them, a search for answers when there are no answers. And this has been linked to absurdist literature, and these ideas in their own right have gone on to be extremely influential in both art and literature. And we have a quote from Spinks here which says, "Because human life is necessarily lived in the absence of transcendental values or moral structures, the ethical purpose of existence for Sartre is for humanity actively to create its values for itself and to develop a style of living and thinking that continually redefines the meaning of what it is to be human." Now we can see here the links to Nietzsche, the idea of an absence of transcendental values and moral structures, and this idea that we will create our own values. Sartre also mentions the term bad faith, and this is a refusal to accept the absurd, a refusal to understand that we must create our own essence. And we could actually possibly link this into Nietzsche's concept of the last man, the individual that won't look at creating meaning for themselves. Nietzsche also has links to the analytic tradition. Now, he's not a direct influence here, but we can see some links between the ideas. So some of the similarities then are that firstly, his criticisms of past methodologies as focusing on metaphysics. So this is something that, of course, is linked to the analytic tradition. And he, of course, made the claim that it is not true and false that matter, but whether the claim makes sense. So this can be linked into the analytic tradition, as I'm sure you can see. And this again links into his interest in language, which of course is connected to the analytic tradition. So even though he is not a direct influence here, we can still see how his ideas fit into the overall picture. Nietzsche has also been linked to developments in the study of history, and he's been connected to New Historicism. Now, this is a form of history study that looks at the relationships between texts, so that rather than looking at the official accounts of historic events, it looks at a variety of personal and varied accounts of those events. And this is linked to Nietzsche's work in genealogy, in that it's interested in the development of how we perceive these historic events and how these can be rooted in our construction of self and in power. Now, when the New Historicism looks at the construction of self, and it makes a connection in how we make that self and in how power runs through society and through history and our conceptions of history. So it's interested in looking at the boundaries between texts and the contexts of how they come about. It's trying to understand in more detail why we come to have the understandings of historic events that we do. So rather than seeing history as something fixed and objective, it's looking at how subjective accounts of history can be valuable. A surprising area where Nietzsche has been influential is actually feminism. Now, as we know, Nietzsche is not generally seen as a feminist. However, his comments on the revaluation of values has actually been linked to feminist critiques of patriarchy, in that the revaluation of values is about looking at the values that society takes for granted, such as patriarchal values, and looking at whether we still want to hold those values, whether they still are of any value. We can also link in, again, Nietzsche's work on genealogy, in that it's looking at a historical construction of values, which again, of course, links to patriarchy. Finally, we can also see a link between the will to power to patriarchy, in that the social construction of patriarchy can be seen as an example of will to power. So, although it may initially seem surprising, Nietzsche's thought has been influential in feminism in terms of trying to understand how patriarchy has been constructed and why it has formed in the way that it has. And of course, in terms of questioning the values that we as a society have. Nietzsche then, as we can see, has been extremely influential in philosophy, in particular his influence in French philosophy and existentialism. And of course, he does have his other influences in the analytic tradition, history and feminism. In our next lecture, we're going to look at some examples about how these ideas have then gone on to be expressed through art and literature.